The first time Mara Whitaker tried to move the rollers in her grandfather's sorghum mill, nothing happened. She had wrapped a chain around the cast iron wheel, braced both boots against a floorboard softened by 30 Kansas winters, and pulled until her shoulders began to shake. The chain tightened with a dry metallic groan. Dust sifted from the rafters. Somewhere overhead, a loose strip of tin clicked against the roof in the spring wind. The wheel did not move. When Mara released the chain, it slapped against the frame and fell still. That silence seemed larger than the building. Outside, the first planters of April were already crossing the county. Diesel engines started before sunrise. Pickup beds carried seed bags, grease guns, and herbicide. Fields that had been brown since November were turning black behind cultivators. At the Whitaker place, the best 18 acres beside the creek remained untouched. Instead of preparing them for corn, Mara was rebuilding a mill that had not processed sweet sorghum since the early 1990s. One wall leaned toward the creek. Wild grapevine had climbed through a broken window. Rain had stained the rafters above the old evaporator pan. The wooden frame beneath the crusher had darkened almost to charcoal from age and dried syrup. For 3 days, Mara swept, removed rotten lumber, soaked seized bolts, and carried rusted hardware into the yard. Then she came back with a borrowed chain hoist. That was when people started slowing down. County Road 16 ran close enough to the mill that drivers could see through its open doors. Mara noticed the same white Ford pass one afternoon, then returned 20 minutes later from the opposite direction. The next day, a blue Chevrolet slowed until the gravel beneath its tires barely cracked. By Friday, no one needed to ask what Mara was doing. Samuel Whitaker's mill was coming apart piece by piece in the hands of his 24-year-old granddaughter. Then 18 acres of good ground went into sweet sorghum. Not field corn, not soybeans. A crop most farmers associated with church festivals and jars of dark syrup on grandparents' pantry shelves. Mara marked planting depth, soil temperature, and emergence in a spiral notebook. Then she returned to the mill. She replaced rotted floorboards with rough oak, cleaned the main shaft with emery cloth, and measured wear with a micrometer that had belonged to her father. She drove nearly 50 miles for bearings the local store no longer carried. When the original belt system proved too dangerous to reuse, she found an electric motor from a grain elevator being dismantled west of town and hauled it home in her father's faded red pickup. At the feed store, the bearings and industrial belt on her cart drew long looks. An older farmer near the seed counter watched the cashier total her purchase. His eyes moved from the parts to Mara's stained hands, then toward Daniel Whitaker's pickup outside. His expression looked almost like sympathy. That stayed with her longer than laughter would have. The Whitaker farm had never been large enough to waste money. Now it had even less room for mistakes. 2 years earlier, Mara had been living 2 counties away, working in an agricultural supply warehouse and coming home on weekends. Her father, Daniel, still ran the farm through old machinery, narrow margins, and the stubborn belief that another season could repair the last one. Then his heart began failing. At first, he stopped carrying 2 mineral bags at once. He rested against loader tires after hooking implements. Tools appeared where he normally would have put them away. Mara noticed before he admitted anything. By the next spring, she had moved home. She fed cattle before sunrise. Daniel handled paperwork at the kitchen table. She drove him to cardiology appointments in Wichita. He hated being driven. He hated asking for help more. The last summer he worked, Mara found him sitting inside the tractor with the engine off, both hands resting on the steering wheel. The field outside was half-cut, heat shimmered over the stubble, and the cooling engine ticked beneath him. He looked older than he had that morning. After that, Mara finished more of the work herself. Daniel died the following January. What he left behind was not a clean inheritance. There were 126 acres, an aging house, 3 declining barns, 23 cattle, 2 tractors that leaked constantly, an ancient combine, and nearly $187,000 in mortgage and operating debt. Mara inherited the land. She also inherited every number attached to it. The following season should have stabilized things. Instead, rain came late. Corn emerged unevenly. By June, heat hardened the ground and curled leaves before noon. Then hail came in August. It stripped ears, shredded leaves, and flattened enough acreage to make harvest almost pointless. Crop insurance kept creditors away for a while. It did not save the balance sheet. In February, the bank manager laid a county map across his desk and circled 40 acres along the highway with a blue pen. Selling that ground would reduce the debt enough to make the remaining farm easier to finance. Mara watched the blue line close around the field. The scratch of the pen against paper was the loudest sound in the office. She took the papers home. They remained unsigned. That field had been purchased by her great-grandfather after the Second World War. But Mara knew history did not pay fuel bills. Family pride could bankrupt people as efficiently as bad weather. That frightened her. She did not want to destroy her own future simply because generations of Whitakers had refused to leave. The sorghum mill complicated that fear. 3 months after Daniel died, Mara climbed into the loft above the machine shed, looking for an old boundary survey. Behind cracked seed signs, she found a green ammunition box wrapped with baling wire. Inside were 3 ledgers. Samuel Whitaker had filled them over more than 20 years. Rainfall, planting dates, cane weights, juice yield, fuel use, batch temperature, sugar readings, names of growers, gallons produced, gallons kept as payment. At first, Mara read the books because they belonged to someone who was dead. Then she read them because the numbers made sense. Samuel had not simply made syrup. He had operated a small processing business. Farmers who could never justify owning their own crusher brought cane to Whitaker Mill. Samuel processed it, cooked it, and either charged a fee or retained a share of the finished syrup. Bagasse became bedding, compost material, or fuel. The mill served farms too small for industrial equipment. The system had disappeared as agriculture consolidated, but the logic had not. One evening, while searching Daniel's old toolbox, Mara found a heavy iron key tied to a faded red tag. It fit the mill door. The discovery bothered her. Daniel had never spoken warmly about the mill. To him, it belonged to a leaner era, when Samuel worked brutal hours to squeeze income from every acre. Yet the key had remained in his toolbox. Later, while dismantling the crusher, Mara found grease deep inside one bearing housing that was newer than the hardened residue around it. Someone had maintained that machine years after it stopped earning money. She could never ask her father why. That became one reason she kept working. There was another. The Whitaker farm's corn numbers had become ugly. Mara knew every fertilizer bill, seed cost, chemical application, and yield figure from the previous 5 seasons. On their lighter ground, the margins were narrowing even in respectable years. Sweet sorghum tolerated heat better, rooted deeper, and could produce considerable biomass without the same input structure as corn. Mara did not need it to be miraculous. She needed it to be useful. By June, another change had appeared along the highway. Prairie Valley Foods, 9 miles outside town, had always been part of the landscape. Its silver roof and grain bins rose behind cottonwoods, and nearly everyone knew someone who worked there. That spring, traffic thinned. One loading bay stayed closed. A hiring banner disappeared. The employee lot began showing empty rows. At the diner, men in Prairie Valley work shirts appeared at hours when their shifts should have been running. The county paper carried a short notice about reduced production following changes by the parent company. Nothing suggested the plant would definitely close. Mara continued as usual, but she wrote the date of the production cut in the back of her notebook. Her plan did not depend on Prairie Valley failing. By then, she had already decided the mill had to survive on her own crop first. She calculated the minimum syrup yield per acre needed to cover harvest and processing. She estimated how much she could realistically sell locally. She visited a bakery, left bottles at farm stores, and contacted a butcher who used molasses-based glaze. Most efforts produced little. One store returned 4 unsold jars. The bakery wanted consistency before volume. The butcher asked about price and stopped responding. Mara recorded everything. By July, rain had almost disappeared. Grass along the road turned the color of straw. Dust coated fence wires. Stock ponds pulled away from their banks. Corn across the county rolled its leaves by noon. Mara's sorghum looked stressed too, but different. The plants slowed. Their leaves dulled. Yet the stalks remained upright. She pushed a soil probe beside several rows and found moisture deeper than expected. At the field edge, the county extension agent split a stalk with a pocket knife and pressed a thumb into the pale pith. Then he crossed the road to examine neighboring corn already firing from the bottom leaves. When he returned, he spent more time studying Mara's notebook than the crop. That evening, Mara stood between the sorghum rows until sunset. The leaves rubbed against one another in the hot wind with a dry, papery whisper. For the first time, the crop no longer looked foolish. It looked alive. The mill remained less cooperative. A replacement bearing overheated. The main belt tracked toward the edge of the pulley and began chewing itself apart. A gear tooth cracked. A used food-grade pump leaked. One propane burner heated unevenly. Each problem cost money. By mid-August, Mara's farm account had fallen below $6,000. The loader tires would survive another season. The machine shed received another roof patch. A broken cattle gate was tied shut with chain. One night, after working until almost 11, Mara poured a scorched test batch into a waste drum, then drove the pickup behind the barn and turned off the engine. She did not go inside. Daniel's truck still smelled faintly of grease, old vinyl, and the menthol cough drops he had kept in the console during his final year. Mara rested her forehead against the steering wheel. For months, grief had become another chore pushed behind livestock, bills, weather, and machinery. That night it came back without warning. What frightened her was not what she remembered about her father. It was what she was beginning to forget. She could picture the veins across his hands and the way his left boot wore faster than the right. But when she tried to hear his voice, it came back blurred. On the passenger seat lay the bank's offer for the 40 acres. Mara stared at the signature line. For the first time, she wondered whether keeping the farm was loyalty at all. Maybe selling part of it would simply mean accepting Daniel was gone. Maybe the mill, the ledger, the old truck, and those 18 acres of sorghum were not a business plan. Maybe they were objects she had arranged around herself so nothing in the family had to end. She sat there until the windows fogged. Then she opened Samuel's ledger. The page contained no encouragement, only arithmetic. Cane weight, juice percentage, finished gallons, fuel, labor. Mara ran her numbers again. They were tight. They were risky. But they were not imaginary. If the crop reached the expected sugar content and she kept processing losses under control, the mill could contribute more per acre than the failed corn had. Not enough to erase the debt. Enough to prove another source of cash flow. Mara folded the land offer and returned it to the glove box. The next morning, she went back to work. By late August, the sorghum stood taller than she did. Mara began cutting test stalks before sunrise, crushing them through a hand press and checking sugar with a refractometer. The first numbers disappointed her. She waited. 3 days later, they improved. Then again. When harvest began, Mara drove the first wagon to the mill and started the motor. For a second, there was only a low electrical hum. Then the belt tightened. A pulley chirped. The gears engaged with a heavy metallic rhythm. The rollers began turning. Mara pushed the first stalk forward. The rollers caught it. There was a dry crack, then a wet crushing sound as the cane flattened between the iron cylinders. Pale green juice ran into the stainless trough. Mara put her fingers beneath the stream and smelled it. Fresh cut grass. Sugar. Earth. The machine had been silent for nearly 30 years. Now it was working. The first batches were uneven. One came out thin, another finished too dark. Mara changed one variable at a time. She adjusted burner pressure, filtering, skimming, batch depth, and finish temperature. She compared each run with Samuel's records, but refused to treat them as scripture. Different cane, different equipment, different conditions. After several failures, the syrup stabilized. Dark amber, clean on the tongue, thick enough to fold from a spoon without becoming tar. A bakery bought 6 gallons. A farm store took a case. The butcher came by for 2 sample jugs. The sales helped. They did not save the farm. Then, Prairie Valley cut another production line. A section of the employee parking lot was chained off. Trucks that once waited at the loading dock vanished. The local paper reported that the parent company was evaluating the facility. Mara read the article twice. She did not celebrate. Prairie Valley employed families she had known her entire life, but she began preparing for disruption. She cleaned a second storage tank, reorganized the mill floor so outside growers could unload safely, and confirmed state food safety requirements for expanded processing. She bought no major equipment. The farm could not afford speculation. 3 weeks later, Prairie Valley Foods announced it would cease operations at the end of the month. By then, no one was shocked. The final Friday, cars filled the employee lot one last time. By Monday, the gate was locked. A county that had relied on one major processor suddenly discovered how many smaller businesses depended on it. A bakery lost part of its supply chain. A school cooperative began searching for regional products. 2 specialty growers lost expected processing capacity. Mara's phone began ringing more often. The bakery wanted another 20 gallons. The butcher returned for bulk syrup. A farm family west of town asked whether she could crush their sorghum. Then another grower called. Within a week, the Whitaker yard sounded different before sunrise. Trailer tires ground over gravel. Hitches clanked. Tailgates struck steel. Engines idled near the mill doors, while steam slipped through the roof vents. Mara marked each load by weight, grower, arrival time, and processing order. Prairie Valley's failure had not created Mara's skill, crop, equipment, customers, or records. It had exposed the value of capacity already there. For 6 days, the mill ran nearly continuously. The electric motor settled into a steady growl. Belts whispered over pulleys. Gear teeth clicked into rhythm. Every few seconds came the sharp crack of another sorghum stalk being caught by the rollers. The evaporator hissed. Juice splashed into tanks. Mara slept in 90-minute stretches on an old cot near the office wall. Then, just after noon on the busiest day of harvest, the sound changed. The steady rhythm developed a faint knock. Then came a vibration through the floor. A metal guard began rattling. Mara hit the shutoff. The motor wound down. The gears turned twice more and stopped. The sudden silence seemed almost violent. Outside, diesel engines were still idling. Inside, juice dripped from the trough 1 drop at a time. She removed the guard and saw the problem. One of the shaft mounts had shifted. The timber beneath it had compressed and split along the grain. The bolts had widened their holes. The shaft was running out of alignment. Restarting could destroy the bearing or damage the shaft. Outside sat 3 loaded trailers of fresh cane. Another was already on the road. Sweet sorghum did not wait well after cutting. Mara lifted the shaft with the chain hoist and removed the damaged mount. The old timber could not simply be tightened. Samuel's ledger showed how the frame had once been braced, but the original reinforcement was gone. There was no replacement waiting on a shelf. Mara walked outside. Beside the machine shed sat a rusted cultivator Daniel had kept for parts. Its frame was useless, but the heavy steel drawbar beneath it was straight. Mara dragged out the cutting torch. The first cut wandered. A drill bit burned dull. Another snapped. One farmer waiting with cane drove home and returned with a larger bit. Another brought a hydraulic jack. No one stood around laughing now. For nearly 5 hours, the mill remained silent while Kane waited in the September heat. The only sounds inside were hammering steel, the whine of the drill, the hiss of the torch, and the heavy chain of the hoist tightening beneath load. Mara cut the drawbar into a brace, drilled new holes, reinforced the weakened timber, reset the shaft, and aligned the pulleys by hand. When she finally lowered the hoist, grease covered her arms, and a burn had opened through one glove. She rotated the shaft manually. One revolution, then another. The belt stayed centered. Mara energized the motor. The low hum returned. A slight vibration remained. She killed the power, adjusted the mount again, and restarted. This time, the floor stayed still. The first trailer began unloading before sunset. By midnight, 2 were empty. The final load entered the mill after 2 in the morning. Some cane had lost sugar. The yield was lower. Mara recorded the loss. But the harvest survived. So did the machine. By the end of the season, Whitaker Mill had processed every acre Mara planted and several neighboring acres. The financial result was not spectacular enough for folklore. It was better. It was believable. Mara's syrup sold steadily through regional stores, bakeries, and direct orders. Processing fees created revenue without requiring her to own every acre. Bagasse went to bedding and compost. One bakery signed a standing order for the following year. 2 growers reserved processing dates before winter. For the first time since Daniel became sick, the Whitaker farm had income that was not entirely tied to commodity grain prices. In December, Mara returned to the bank. The same county map lay on the desk. The same 40 acres along the highway were still marked in blue. This time, Mara placed 12 months of records beside it. Sorghum yield. Finished gallons. Processing fees. Customer orders. Expenses. Contracts for the next season. The bank manager opened the first folder. He turned through the pages slowly. Last February, he had moved through Mara's numbers quickly, pausing only long enough to identify what could be sold. Now his finger stopped at the processing fees, then the bakery order, then the commitments already booked for the next harvest. The wall clock ticked above a filing cabinet. Mara sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched him turn another page. Beside his elbow lay the county map. The blue circle around the 40 acres was still there. After several minutes, the manager pulled the map toward himself. For an instant, Mara thought he was going to point at the field again. Instead, he folded the map along the county line. Then he folded it once more. He slid it beneath the loan file. The blue pen remained untouched near the edge of the desk. The bank did not erase Mara's debt. It recognized that the farm now had a functioning enterprise. The overdue balance could be brought current. The remaining debt could be restructured around the new cash flow. When Mara walked through the lobby, she carried a restructuring agreement instead of a land sale contract. Outside, she sat in Daniel's pickup for several seconds before starting it. Then she drove home past the 40 acres along the highway. The field was still hers. By spring, pickups still slowed near Whitaker Mill. Now they turned into the driveway. Gravel snapped beneath tires. Farmers carried soil reports, seed catalogs, and acreage estimates inside. Some wanted to try sweet sorghum, others wanted processing space. The county extension agent returned with a clipboard and spent an afternoon reviewing Mara's yield data. Mara gave no speeches. She simply kept records and expanded carefully. The second season, she planted 26 acres instead of 18. She added a used finishing pan, upgraded the wash station, and created processing days for smaller growers. The mill remained imperfect. Belts still needed adjustment. Bearings still needed grease. Weather still mattered. Some batches were better than others. That mattered. A perfect ending would have turned the mill into another fantasy. The farm could still lose money. It could still be hurt by drought, hail, markets, illness, or one bad decision. But it was no longer surviving on one narrow path. One afternoon the following fall, Mara finished a processing run and shut the motor down. The rollers slowed. Steam thinned beneath the rafters. In the quiet, she noticed the iron key hanging beside the door. Daniel's key. She had cleaned the rust from it, but never replaced the faded red tag. For a long moment she held it in her hand. She still could not remember his voice perfectly. That pain had not disappeared, but she no longer believed keeping the farm meant refusing to let him go. The farm was not Daniel. The mill was not Samuel. The land was not a museum. What they left behind mattered, because Mara could understand what they had learned and decide what was still useful. Samuel had understood small-scale processing. Daniel had understood soil, weather, machinery, and the danger of depending too heavily on one crop. Mara had inherited pieces from both. Then she had changed them. On the wall above the workbench, she framed one page from Samuel's ledger. It contained no sentimental message, only rainfall, cane weights, fuel use, gallons produced, and a list of growers who had brought their harvest there decades earlier. Beneath it, Mara mounted a new clipboard. The names were different. The idea was not. By the third harvest, sweet sorghum grew on several farms along County Road 16. Before dawn, trailer tires began grinding across the Whitaker gravel. Tailgates struck steel. Chains rattled against wagon frames. The mill lights came on, while most houses were still dark. Then came the sound Mara had once been unable to pull from the building at all. The low growl of the electric motor. The whisper of belts tightening over pulleys. The heavy rhythm of gears taking load. And finally the dry crack, followed by the wet crush, of sorghum stalks disappearing between the rollers. Juice flowed into the trough. Steam climbed toward the rafters, carrying the smell of hot syrup, wet cane, wood, and grease. 30 years earlier, the mill had gone silent. Now its sound carried across the yard before sunrise. 9 miles away, the old Prairie Valley building still stood behind locked gates. Its loading docks were empty, and weeds pushed through cracks in the employee lot. Its closure had hurt the town. No small mill could replace everything the plant had done. But the loss taught the county something it had forgotten. Efficiency was not the same as resilience. A system built around one large plant could look strong until the day the gate was locked. A small mill could look obsolete until the day somebody needed it. Samuel Whitaker had once built his business around farmers too small to matter to industrial processors. Mara rebuilt it for almost the same reason. The mill survived not because Prairie Valley failed at the perfect moment, not because an old ledger contained a secret fortune, and not because Mara predicted the future. It survived because she noticed weaknesses others ignored, studied numbers they dismissed, repaired equipment they considered useless, and built something valuable before anyone could guarantee it would be needed. The machine that saved the Whitaker farm had never been magic. It was simply ready. And on autumn mornings, when trailers rolled down County Road 16 and the old mill began to turn, Mara could look across the 40 acres she had almost sold and see sorghum moving in the wind. The land was still hers. The debt was manageable. The mill had work waiting. Behind her came the growl of the motor, the rattle of steel, and the steady cracking of cane between the rollers. For the first time since her father died, Mara no longer felt as though she were trying to keep the past alive. She was building something that could outlive her, too.